Thank you for the welcome and good afternoon to everyone, as well as good evening. It's nice to be back again. I do appreciate the disclaimer because clearly when we're trying to study the secret doctrine, there's no absolute definitive endpoint. So what we're going to try to do today is walk through these stanzas. And really, what I'd like to do more than anything else is just share some of the ways that I look at the stanzas. They are clear in themselves in what they reference, but I believe that the windows and the ways that they can be understood are many, many more than we typically think of. So this one way today that we will share is just one of many. To put things in perspective, clearly we've heard talks on stanzas 2, stanzas 4, 5. We're going to hear on stanza 1. And so there's a continuity throughout stanza 7. And I'm sure many of you have pondered over these stanzas for years and years and years. So there may not be much new, but again, just perhaps a different perspective in sharing. To put this stanza in perspective, I'd really like to read from what is really the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. And this portion comes out of the proem from the Secret Doctrine because it puts the stanzas in a certain order and brackets them in such a way that you know, in a sense, where we're coming from and where we're going. And so she states in stanza 3, proem, stanza 3 describes the reawakening of the universe to life after pralaya. So we're not talking about necessarily the actual manifestation, but just waking up. It depicts the emergence of the monads from their state of absorption within the one. And so we know that we've started out with what that state would be related to stanza 1 as it pertains to pralaya. Stanza 2 as it pertains to the awakening energies related to the unmanifest logos, and up to stanza 3. She says the earliest and the highest stage in the formation of worlds is this representation. The term monad being one which may apply equally to the vastest solar system or the tiniest atom. So right away, she's letting us know that although we're only talking about the solar system, the emergence of the monad pertains to multiple levels of application, multiple stages in that process. And to really bracket this, again, we've come from stanza 2 and stanza 4 you've heard, but let's read what she says about that so that we know where we're focusing on. She says, stanza 4 shows the differentiation of the germ of the universe. So we've got the monad, and then we have the germ of the universe, two different things. And she says, it is the differentiation of the germ into the septenary hierarchies of conscious divine powers, who are the active manifestations of the one supreme energy. And she then goes on to say that those are the shapers and the framers of everything that will follow in regards to manifestation. So we're somewhere between the awakening of the unmanifest logos, the second stage or that logoic second logos, and then the awakening of, or the manifestation of the germ. And that's where we kind of left off before. And so here we're stuck in this limbo between the germ and now the awakening of the universe in its monadic form, and yet not engaging in differentiation. And so we have to ask ourselves, where are we really? And so what we're going to do today is hear stanzas 1 through 12 in the context of what we've just read so that we can see how she unfolds those stanzas. And I took a little bit of liberty, so I did put it to a little background music quietly. But again, first we're going to hear those stanzas, and then we're going to look at each one of them briefly. And then hopefully we'll have time to look at some of the questions that arose in transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge in terms of the students that were trying to understand these stanzas and in what context we might understand them. So let me go to screen sharing here. And the first 5 minutes should be pertaining to the play of these 1 through 12 stanzas. Stanza 3, Sloka 1. The last vibration of the seventh eternity thrills through infinitude. The mother swells, expanding from within without, like the bud of the lotus. 2. The vibration sweeps along, touching with its swift wing the whole universe and the germ that dwelleth in darkness, the darkness that breathes over the slumbering waters of life. 3. Darkness radiates light, and light drops one solitary ray into the mother deep. The ray shoots through the virgin egg. The ray causes the eternal egg to thrill and drop the non-eternal germ, which condenses into the world egg. 4. Then the 3 fall into the 4. The radiant essence becomes 7 inside and 7 outside. The luminous egg, which in itself is 3, curdles and spreads in milk-white curves throughout the depths of mother, the root that grows in the depths of the ocean of life. 5. The root remains, the light remains, the curds remain, and still Oeahu is one. 6. The root of life was in every drop of the ocean of immortality, and the ocean was radiant light, which was fire and heat and motion. Darkness vanished and was no more. It disappeared in its own essence, the body of fire and water, or father and mother. 7. Behold, Olanu, the radiant child of the two, the unparalleled, refulgent glory, bright space, son of dark space, which emerges from the depths of the great dark waters. It is Oeahu, the younger. He shines forth as the sun. He is the blazing dragon of wisdom. The one is 4, and 4 takes to itself 3, and the union produces the Saka, in whom are the 7, which become Tridasha, or the host and multitudes. Behold, him lifting the veil and unfurling it from east to west. He shuts out the above and leaves the below to be seen as the great illusion. He marks the places for the shining ones and turns the upper into a shoreless sea of fire, and the one manifested into the great waters. 8. Where was the germ, and where was now darkness? Where is the spirit of the flame that burns in thy lap, O Lani? The germ is that, and that is light, the white, brilliant sun of the dark hidden Father. 9. Light is cold flame, and flame is fire, and fire produces heat, which yields water, the water of life in the Great Mother. Father, Mother, spin a web whose upper end is fastened to spirit, the light of the one darkness, and the lower one to its shadowy end, matter. In this web is the universe, spun out of the two substances made in one, which is Swabhavat. 11. It expands when the breath of fire is upon it. It contracts when the breath of the mother touches it. The suns expand and contract through their own selves and hearts. They embrace infinitude. 12. Then Swabhavat sends Fohat to harden the atoms. Each is a part of the web, reflecting the self-existent Lord. Like a mirror, each becomes, in turn, a world. Okay, so this is the only stanza that has 12 slokas. And we can ask ourselves why, or we can just accept that it's one of the longest. And yet, when we think about it, we're ending up with Fohat hardening the atoms. And so we still have not yet had the manifestation of what we're familiar with considering to be called the solar system. And so one of the questions in my mind as I walk through these words is, where are we? What state of consciousness is this cosmological drama unfolding in? And then the other side of that is, what condition of substance is this happening in? Why? Because substance as we understand it hasn't yet manifested. And yet we're being referenced to real processes that are occurring. And so if we think perhaps that stanza 4, as with HPB's diagram on page 200, represents the real stage of external perceptible manifestation, i.e. the atoms that she calls back and forth in transactions, atoms versus molecules, and then explains how she's using those terms, then everything else that we're referring to here, including stanzas 1 and 2, are occurring on perhaps those inner 3 planes. And so, because we're not typically familiar with living and breathing and interacting and manipulating things on those 3 planes, although they are tangible planes. And one of my favorite quotes, I guess, that I'll read here, also coming from Transactions, is that he explains to us, if I can find it, wouldn't you know? Nonetheless, I guess karmically I've misplaced it. But she tells us that even though she calls these inner planes, planes of non-being. For intelligences within those planes, they are clearly planes of being and substantiation. So although we consider them to be extremely metaphysical or spiritual or whatever terms we want to use, Atma, Buddhic, and Manasic, they are still real, subjectively tangible things, conditions, and processes that are unfolding. So we can't just write them off and say, okay, that happens in spiritual realms, and now we're down to Earth or solar system dealing with atoms. And so that's something very, very important to keep in mind, because we have to ask ourselves, how is the awareness of this possible? And perhaps, how relevant is it? And so as we move forward, and maybe I can leave the screen like this instead of occupying the whole screen, because I can see some of you on the side, and I like looking at faces. So what we can do now is go through these kind of one by one. And so we'll jump to the first stanza, sloka. The last vibration of the seventh eternity thrills through infinitude. And HPB explains to us that this last vibration of what we can remember has to do with the unmanifested logos, the development of the second logoic stage or logos, and its initial effort to create the germ. The germ that will give rise to the universe typically is manifested and created prior to everything that we're encountering in stanza 4. And yet we're somewhere between the germ and what she defines in transactions as the nebula state, which is in some respects different than the Milky Way galaxy state, both of which are referenced in the Secret Doctrine and Transactions. And so she describes this term, seventh eternity, as being sanctified in the esoteric doctrines. And it's sanctified because of what perhaps it embraces. We look at that and we say, okay, it's the seventh vibration, but it brings up the question of time and space. And here we clearly have to acknowledge that space, time, and dimensionality has not yet manifested in a way that we are familiar with it. And yet it is. And so between stanzas 1 and 2, we have to acknowledge that we need a different way of seeing and a different way of thinking. And that way of seeing and that way of thinking has to do with the keywords that she uses, vibration, and its various modalities of expression. And one of the expressions that she uses here is thrills. And so we have to think of words not so much as human concepts here, but as she says, symbolic representations to indicate inner processes that we typically don't think about as they relate to, in this case, cosmogenesis. But she also informs us, and this is the beauty of the stanzas as they stand, even though many of them have been left out. She says that these stanzas represent the cosmological side of things, the obviously anthropological side of things in book 2, but also in book 1. If you're tuning into the structures and the what we can simply call fractals that are pervasive within the teachings, you will see the same patterns repeat and repeat and repeat in different ways, under different conditions, on different planes. And so these stanzas, vibration and thrilling, relate to a state of consciousness that we can attune to. They relate to a state of cosmogenesis, pre-differentiation. They relate to states of embryology. Physiology, she tells us, within the transactions, and many other mystical states, as well as occult understanding. Again, all of which are different ways of seeing, understanding, and appreciating the stanzas. This vibration thrilling through infinitude, boundlessness, no limitations, no differentiation. So it's everything, and yet it's only one thing. No time, no space, no dimension. And that requires then that one point literally becoming the entire expanse of boundless expression. And that I believe she mentions in terms of the circle whose point is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. We can appreciate that cosmologically, we can appreciate that mystically, we can appreciate that in meditational states. Non-differentiation in its many forms, and yet filled with a subtle vibrational thrill. And this becomes, as we see in one of its expressions, the spirit latent in matter, the light within the darkness. And that brings us to the mother that swells, expanding from within without, like the bud of the lotus. Just in these words, the mother, what that represents, what that symbolically means, expanding from within without. And she says, in terms of expanding, that it's really a change of condition. So again, we're talking about something, but typically things that we do not deal with in everyday experience, not unless we're taking an inner journey. And so that mother state of matter, of substance, of pre-substance, of the womb, of whatever we want to call it, of Mula Prakriti, is the flip side of that inner thrill, that vibration. Parabam, perhaps. And we see this in her expression that when she's talking in transactions, she speaks about that vibration that comes from beyond Mula Prakriti itself. And so in a sense, it's a tease, but in the sense it's an invitation. And that invitation is an introduction, again, to a whole different way of thinking, a whole different way of being, and a whole different world of experience. So when we're looking for the subjective within the objective, i.e., the expanding from within without, what are we looking for? She says, like the bud of the lotus. And what is that bud? In the transactions, she explains to us that that bud is, in fact, the perfect image, the product in perfect form pre-birth, i.e., the perfect image of what the universe can be. The perfect image according to which, and as a result of which, law itself operates. So again, just in this first stanza, we're being invited to a pre-cosmically manifest state of consciously becoming aware of certain laws and of certain imagery, of certain patterns, of certain vibrational interactions that exist, that are real, more real than much of what we typically accept as real, because they are the very heart of everything that we're looking at externally. A lot more could be said about sloka 1, but let's move on to 2. The vibration sweeps along, touching with its swift wing the whole universe. And again, no time, no space, no dimension. So that point, which is everything and everywhere, is the universe that will be. And yet it's the universe in its, I'll put the word in quotes, primordial form, without differentiation, without structure, yet existent. And the germ that dwelleth in darkness. So now we're talking about the vibration, which is actually, when we think about it, the very cause of the germ, because it is one with the germ as well as the darkness. And what does HPB tell us the darkness is? The darkness represents the absoluteness. And again, she makes a distinction between the absoluteness and the absolute. And the absolute in Parabrahm and Mulapakriti. And so this invites us to recognize what we can think of as the range of, and again, the words fail myself, but the range of distinct stages that we have to begin to think about or sense in different ways, because there is that which we cannot say anything about. And then we use the word absoluteness, and yet she tells us the absoluteness is not the absolute. So there's a gap there and a continuity there that we're invited to, for lack of a better thing, contemplate. And then from Parabrahm to Mulapakriti, even if we think of those as one, we've got another stage moving into that of the expression of the unmanifest logos. And she speaks about that, and she speaks about the channel through which the logos itself expresses itself. So that's another stage of reality that we typically don't appreciate. From the logos, then we're moving to the second and the formation of the third in terms of the germ. That's another stage of activity, development, and consciousness that we don't think about. And when we say consciousness, obviously we can't talk about cognitive rational consciousness pertaining to sensory objective phenomena. And then we're moving from the germ to what we're talking about in stanza 3, the formation of the stuff, the world stuff, that will give rise then to the galaxies and to the Milky Ways, etc. And so we're talking about several stages and steps even before we talk about the existence of those lower four planes upon which manifestation, no matter how subjectively we appreciate it, i.e. archetypal, creative, formative, and physical, as she expresses on 200 in the SD, are unfolding. And so here in 2, she's taking us to the darkness that is, in a sense, the germ, and yet is the very life. And she tells us that the first 2 in the secret doctrine are life and that universal pulse, and then mind. Life is, mind becomes. And so we're still in this darkness stage. We're trying to appreciate the motions, and that's not the correct word, but of that vibrational life that somehow or another creates that germ that will give rise to this universe. Number 3, in terms of slides. Number 5, in terms of sloka, the root remains, the light remains, the courage remain. Did I miss something? Yes. Number 3 is darkness radiates light, and light drops one solitary ray into the mother deep. The ray shoots through the virgin egg. The ray causes the eternal egg to thrill and drop the non-eternal germ, which finally condenses into the world egg or world stuff. Now think about this. How many ideas do we have here that are pointing to information that we typically gloss over? Darkness. Out of that darkness radiates light. And so in one From one point of view, again, we can see the absolute. We can talk about the unmanifest first logos, or we can talk about the germ and its radiation of light, which is a different stage of that same process. And then we have to ask, what is light? And then what is the mother deep? Because the mother deep at this particular stage is not the mother that we spoke about in the very beginning. And she makes these distinctions and definitions distinct in the conversations that she has in Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. And then she talks about the virgin egg. She talks about the eternal egg. What's the difference? And the order that she put them in, virgin first as opposed to eternal after. And yet she tells us several definitions of the word virgin. In this context, she just says that she means virgin egg as that productivity-ness, the ability to, the potential, the power that will give rise. And the eternal is that which, if we're thinking of it as coming after the virgin egg, will be responsible for the duration of cosmic manifestation, those Mahamanvantaras. And then she goes into those in Transactions, and she talks about the virgin egg from the point of view of eggness, and then she talks about it from the point of view of the virgin as having been differentiated. And if it's differentiated, then it cannot be the virgin egg in Sloka 3, because we're still in a stage of pre-differentiation. And so we have to ask then, what in our consciousness holds these same characteristics that can give rise to universes of thought, creativity, and understand divine ideation. But again, eventually this moves forward, and then the eternal egg drops the non-eternal germ. Now, is the non-eternal germ the same as the germ in stanza 3 that was created, or are we at a different stage? And obviously we have to be at a different stage because we're looking at a progression. And we can tell ourselves that, yes, there are stanzas that are missing, and maybe some of this, just doesn't sound as though it flows. But if we're really trying to accept the teachings as the teachings, then there are deep thoughts here in regards to what's really going on. And then to wrap this sloka up, that world egg, again, she makes a point talking about the fact that it has to do with the world stuff. It is the stuff that comes out of the Laya condition, still pre-differentiation, that eventually becomes the stuff that she calls the Milky Way. And we have to keep in mind that the distinctions that they made then are not necessarily the distinctions that we make now in terms of 2021 as we understand modern physics or modern cosmology. And yet the connections are there. 4, then the 3 fall into the 4. The radiant essence becomes 7 inside and 7 outside. The luminous egg, which is in itself 3, curdles and spreads in milk-white curds throughout the depths of mother, the root that grows in the depths of the ocean of life. And so here again, the ocean of life is omniscient, boundless, infinite. The depths of mother pertain to the substantial side of that. The radiant essence, if we're going to talk about it from the point of view of cosmic manifestation, she says point blank, again, represents the light that's reflected within those nebulic states, or the lights that is reflected coming out of the Laya states. But then she throws us a curve, and she tells us that light and darkness, in all of these terms, in all of the stanzas, we have to understand in a dynamic way as being relative. Because she says, for instance, in talking about the darkness of the absolute is not the darkness of the first logos. The darkness of the first logos appears to be light to the darkness of the absolute. The first logos itself appears to be darkness to the second logos. The germ and all of those things that are manifested are light, relatively speaking, but the germ arose from the activity of the second logos. Hence, the second logos becomes darkness. And she's telling us that because in some regards, we require a flexibility of thought. One thing is not one thing. If we think in terms of concreteness, which is a sensory-based modality of thinking, we can never understand the process that is going on, as she says, simultaneously as it relates to these events that have simply been pulled out of simultaneity and expressed in linear form for our benefit. When I say our, I mean just human consciousness as it exists today. And then we have to ask, what are those three in falling into the four? And here again, we get many aspects. The first three logos falling into the fourth as the manifest. If we switch over to cosmogenesis, we can think about literally today, modern physics, the quarks, three quarks, their counterparts falling into the fourth as the nucleus of that atom, or the atom itself, the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons falling into those elements that we come to understand. Or we can talk about the absolute and the Parabrahm and Mulaprakriti. So we see again these patterns of threes falling into the four. And she gives us the example of the triangle. And when that triangle reflects itself into that point, that fourth point, now we have what looks like a diamond with a line in the middle. So we have two triangles, one upwards, one downwards. The true divine thought in the divine bosom, i.e., ideation in substance reflecting itself into the sun or into the manifested, or if we put it back into that metaphysical category and that meditational category, we're talking about the Atma, Buddhi, and higher manas reflecting itself into a lower manas, because the lower manas is that which deals with incarnation. And once that reflection is done, if we push that point upwards with its triangle, now we've got a six-pointed star. And we know that central point of the star represents the whole. And so the seven inside and the seven outside then become a reflection of that four, cosmically, psychologically, metaphysically, and anthropologically. So again, the flexibility and the relativity, not for confusion, but for deep understanding and for meditational direction, is all here. And that luminosity then, again, is the egg, which is that boundless, perhaps limit, ring past not, that this particular degree of manifestation will go through, all occurring within that infinite ocean of life. And there's only one life. And so this is a process that's occurring within all of us, for each and all of us, all at the same time. The root remains, the light remains, the courage remain, and still Oeahu is one. And she speaks about that seven-voweled term as the blazing dragon of wisdom, as the, in a sense, depending upon which application and approach we're using, we could call Brahma, we could call the manifest logos, we could call the light, we could call the synthesis of these seven Dhyani Chohans. All of that plus more is reflected in those seven vowels. And she explains some of that in Transactions as well, in terms of what that means in terms of sound, vibration, words, pronunciation, cosmologically, what it pertains to in terms of our principles. And so there is a tremendous amount of information, again, impacted in a very simple line. The root will always be there because it's absolute and it supports us. The logoic aspects of ourselves will always be there as roots. The germ will always be there as a root because the germ is what we have evolved from as it relates to manifestation. Whether that manifestation is rupic, i.e. the four lower planes, or arupic, the three higher planes, or pre, or we might say trans arupic, as it relates to the deeper inner planes. All of that is there. The courage remains, the light remains, and everything still remains one. The billions of monads are still one monad. The appearance of the billions of lives are still one life. Whether we look at it pre-space, time, and dimension, or post-differentiation when time begins, as she says, that is when we can really begin to mark time at the end of that third or middle point of that third stanza. The root of life was in every drop of the ocean of immortality, and every drop is every monad, and every monad is immortal, whether it's the monadic nature of the cosmos, of the solar system, of the planet, or of the individual. And the ocean was radiant light if we could only perceive it inwardly through our deep contemplations, perhaps meditation, perhaps altruistic service, or whatever. Again, all aspects of the universe unite within what is called man. Hence, we have access to all of these simultaneously. It matters only which channel, as I sometimes think of it, as we decide to tune into, and for what motivational reasons. The ocean was radiant light, and here we go again, and she explains this so well in the transactions and in the dialogues and everything else, which was fire and heat and motion. Darkness vanished and was no more. It disappeared in its own essence, the body of fire and water, or father and mother. And she explains fire as being cold darkness. The absolute is a fire that has its own pulsatory nature. And when it's heating up, so to speak, it's time to awaken, just like stanza 3 is about awakening. That awakening occurs within the boundlessness of the absolute. And that coal fire then becomes heat. Why? Because of its vibratory motion. And she speaks to us in the Secret Doctrine about how that vibratory motion itself modifies in order to manifest different aspects of itself. And in that respect, those that are, again, familiar with Yaka Burma, he explains this in his own mystical terms in unique ways and shows how one thing unfolds from another, how they are compounded, what those principles are, and how they produce each other, i.e., how fire produces heat. As a result of the motion, the heat produces water. And as HPB tells us in the Secret Doctrine, all of that condenses and becomes cold and dependent upon the light and the heat of the sun, depending again upon what application we're making. Father and mother are the polar aspects of all things that have become manifest, whether subtly manifest, whether, again, arupic, or on their way to becoming expressed in what we call objective form. Behold, Olanu, the radiant child of the two, the unparalleled refulgent glory, bright space, son of dark space, which emerges from the depths of the great dark waters, Oeahu the younger. Again, the blazing dragon of wisdom. One is four. Those three in any aspect, Atma Buddhi Manas, again, quirks, atoms, the Logi, Parabrahm, Mulaprakriti, the Absolute, all those threes are prototypical reflections of each other. And she spends time talking about prototypes in the astral light, and that astral light she then clarifies, which means Akashic light. And she says that the Akasha is the field of primordial consciousness that unfolds within the field of, and I forget the exact terms, but likely the absolute, but not the absolute absolute. So again, she's giving us a progression and how that Akasha unfolds, but the Akasha itself and the ideations within it are reflections of the divine thought in the divine bosom. So again, we're going back to stanza 2. And yet all of these repeat in prototypical reflective fashion, plane after plane after plane. And so we can follow their continuity. And when we are able to modify our understandings about those conditions and the processes and the states and the planes, and understand that non-being is being, when the intelligible aspect of our spiritual nature is able to attune and resonate with that, then all of this becomes much more clear. The 1 is 4, 4 takes to itself 3, the union produces the sapta. And again, whether we're talking about the 7 dhyani chohans, coming to be, because again, they become differentiated in stanza 4. And fohat, coming to be, their steed, the energy, if we can use that gross term, that is reflective of the divine ideation that impresses within the substance the laws of nature as they are seen in that Mahamanvantaric image of all things that can be, i.e., in the germ that will unfold for the entire or throughout the entire duration of that Mahamanvantara. And these then enter into or manifest the multitudes, i.e., the various differentiations in cosmos. Behold him lifting the veil and unfurling it from east to west, a metaphor in some respects of the awakening sun, the blazing dragon, the light of the logos, and the transition from awakening to setting. Or depending upon what cycles you're looking at, different phases in times of expression. He shuts out the above and leaves the below to be seen as the great illusion. He marks the places for the shining ones and turns the upper into a shoreless sea of fire and the one manifested into the great waters. And by now you should be familiar with some of the way poetically these terms are being used to represent different degrees of substance, different aspects of fire, fire functioning on different planes, and what those things are like. And here, this is shutting out, in one respect, everything from the absolute to those 3 logi, to even the dhyani chohans, because typically we do not even see into that domain. And then we're stuck with the Maya of the stars, their energy, and the manifestations of that energy, which are related to our forms, our globe, our elements, our kingdoms, and our lower principles. Then she says, where was the germ and where was now darkness? Where is the spirit of the flame that burns in thy lamp, O Lanu? The germ is that is light, the white brilliant sun of the darkened Father. So again, we're seeing a continuity that we are connected to from the absoluteness to this manifest side of our being. And yet still we have to think that we're not yet manifested, i.e. as in stanza 4. It's all there. And she says in transactions, really, this is just a figurative way of speaking. Where is the spirit and the flame that burns in thy lamp? But if we think about it, it's much more than figurative. It's a reality. The darkness is there. The clarity is there. The fire is there. The potential of the light is there. The germ is there. And what becomes manifested is nowhere near what is there. Light is cold flame, flame is fire, fire produces heat, which yields water, the water of life in the Great Mother. And again, we're looking at a train of events, a number of processes of fire in its cold form, as she says, moving to fire in its warm form, and how these transform. And from the esoteric occult side, she says, fire is the first element. Typically, when we're looking at many of the Hindu or Indian scriptures, they talk about the Akasha, then air, then fire, then water and earth. And there's a reason for that. But in this particular application, we're looking at a different level of fire. And that fire she ties into deity. And deity rests on the absolute. So again, we're being given a direct linkage and heritage to that which is eternal, immortal, omniscient, omnipotent, and omniformative, i.e., it will express any form we can conceptually think of because the perfect type, the prototype, is there. And that is also part of our evolutionary journey. Father, mother, spin a web whose upper end is fashioned to spirit, the light of the one darkness, the lower to its shadowy end matter. And this web is the universe spun out of the two substances made in one, which is Swahaba. So again, we're talking about spirit, matter, and the source out of which they come. HPB talks about a certain idea. Subarao speaks about it. And one thing that you might do in your spare time is correlate these 12 slokas with the article 12 signs of the zodiac. Because in that, the stages of unfolding that he talks about, especially the unfolding of the universe in the thought, and that's number 8. There are, depending on how you look at the article, there are 4 threes, i.e. stages, or 3 fours as stages. And the first 4 pertain to much of what was spoken about in terms of the logos, the absolute, etc. The next 4 talk about the 36 tattvas, or the energies that are necessary to create the universe, and the universe in thought, not the universe in manifestation. And then the next 4 have to do with the universe objectively as to shape. And then Subarao talks about the creators, or the Prajapati, or what might be equivalent in some respects to the Dhyani Chohans and their creative forces, i.e. framers, shapers, etc. And then talks about the 7 inside and the 7 outside in terms of the lokas and the talas, or the principles inwardly, subjectively, and outwardly. And then comes down to the basic elements. And so that's a very interesting article to read in terms of correlating just with this stanza alone, as well as with many of the others. And so this is, in a sense, another summary of everything that's going on and the connection that we have and the one that exists on many levels. So Swahaba is one, the absolute is one, the unmanifest logos is one, and out of each of those ones, 2 come, i.e. spirit and matter in this case. And that breath of fire, we're talking about coal fire as absolute spirit and its own inherent breath, i.e. vibratory motion that pertain to slokas 1 and 2 in regards to the keynotes for understanding this stanza in more of its completion. And the contraction and the expansion represent that pulse that exists at the heart of life, in the highest form, in the most subjective manifestations and applications, as well as in the heart within our bodies that beat in that way, expanding, contracting. Again, another fractal image, another prototypical reflection that occurs. And then 12, Swabhava sends Fohat to harden the atoms. Finally, we're getting to the point of relatively concrete manifestation, but hardening the atoms, if we correlate this with modern physics today, really represents what they call the activity of the Higgs field and the Higgs boson. And the Higgs field and the Higgs boson in cosmology today is that field that is a little bit atypical in terms of how it operates, but it is the one thing that gives mass to everything that becomes a particle or an object. The field itself is purely arupic, as many of the fields that we know electromagnetic. The vibrations accumulate to create the images of particles. And yet this field itself is the very thing, as like Foha, that hardens the atoms and makes the concrete manifestation of subjective universal activity, i.e. what's going on in those nuclei to create the hydrogen, to generate the heliums, the processes then that go on in the stars to create the different levels of elements is about. And yet she says that each is a part of the web. And we can think about that quantum world where every particle reflects every other particle, and metaphysically, cosmically, and even from the point of view of human, we reflect each other. Many of the same emotions, same needs, same activities, same functions of the heart, intestines, same functions of the brain with different emphasis. Each reflects the self-existent Lord, i.e. that which is immortal. Each becomes a world. And so when we start from that monad at the beginning, that is awakening in cosmos, whether it's a particle of an atom, or whether it is the monad of the entire universe, each reflects that one life. Each reflects also all of the processes that we spoke about in the earlier stanzas up to this point. Hence, each is a part of that divine life, and each is the potential for the expression of omniscience and omnipotence according to law and karma. There's so much more that could be said, but I will just wrap then this up with this stanza. Sloka is from stanza 4. And it just goes to show, again, putting things in perspective, that it is at 4 that the effulgency of light, the ray of the ever darkness, spring in space, the reawakened energies, now they're coming to life. And again, this is 4 as the differentiation of the germ. The 1 from the egg, the 6, the 5, and we know that is pi 3.141516, and the arupa and the rupa. So now we're talking about those 3 higher planes that HPB talks about we have to attune to, and then the 4 lower. And so that's why we say there is so much in between that we take for granted that unless we really tune into, we miss. And those things are truly the heart of what we are. And we come to an understanding of that in different ways. Again, I'll use the word meditation and contemplation very loosely, but truly HPB says the wisdom reveals itself within the nature of our being. And if they're writing about it, it must mean that there are those that know about it. And so on that note, I will just end, but I would say it's really interesting to read the questions in transactions that were asked or in the dialogues, because you will see that many of these terms are used in so many different ways. They're applied on so many different levels. And HPB tells us that we have to be very mindful of where we are in terms of planes and states of consciousness when we're making applications of these ideas. So enough said. I'm going to stop sharing and then we're